And I'm kind of interested to see your take as to what happened in London. I mean, you are in London, so you got a taste of the riots firsthand that were going on in London. We also had quite a strong showing in Australia. I sent you a video of Avi Yemini. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, who covered the riots in Melbourne, the protests in Melbourne, and he covered it from, I would say, comedic standpoint as well, and he showed the ridiculousness of it all. But I'll put a link for that video as well. I think he did a good job. And
so we're here at the Black Lives Matter protest in Melbourne, Australia. Now we've come here to ask some basic questions because we're in a COVID crisis at the moment, restrictions. Anybody can be fined for going to work, but 40,000 people have descended on the city for the death of an African American in Minnesota at the hands of a white police officer. So, do any of them even know Justine Damon's name? The Australian woman that was murdered by the same police force. Let's find out. She got shot dead by an African American. Is that just as bad or not?
No, it's not. No, it's not. No, it's not.
It's just shit, the amount of people that are like, all lives matter. It's like, yeah, okay.
Does all lives matter?
Not right now.
Why do you think no one ever protested like this? 40,000 people in the city for somebody who's not even Australian. But when Justine Damon was shot dead, and she doesn't have a criminal history, why do you think that is?
Well, I'd have to say that's a bit of white supremacy, is it not? You know, that's not...
Why is it white supremacy?
Well, because she's white. Because she's white. She's white.
Do you know how many white Australians have died in police custody?
I don't really care, to be honest.
Are you arguing with the statistic or you just don't like it?
I think you need to talk to people of colour and get their voices.
I'm a person of colour. In America, the statistic for white people to die at the hands of police is much higher than the rate of... No?
I don't really. We're going to go.
You don't care about facts? Can I ask you guys, which dog matters more, the black one or the brown one? Have you heard of a woman called Justine Damon?
Yeah.
Who's she? No?
No, I haven't.
You haven't? Have you heard of her?
No.
How you going, mate? Are you an anti-fascist?
Oh, fuck off, Avi.
But, mate, I'm a person of colour. You've just used your white privilege to silence a person of colour.
You know, we have to start in Minnesota, where all of this happened, in Minneapolis. And now Minneapolis is taking the initiative to push forward this latest campaign to defund the police. And, you know, they started it very broad and they said, let's defund the police. The city council voted on it. And now, you know, they're starting to walk it back a little. They're starting to say, well, we don't want to defund all the police. We want to, you know, take some money and put it into social programs and, you know, have like community activist policing as well. And so, I mean, I think like the Democrat Party, even Joe Biden, even though he was in support of defunding the police, you know, tried to explain it away a little. We saw a lot of this in the Green New Deal as well, when they pushed the Green New Deal in the beginning and they said, we're going to get rid of planes. And we're going to get rid of cars. And then they walked it back and said, well, we don't really mean get rid of planes and cars. We're just going to take some money and reallocate it and put some resources that were going to these things and put them elsewhere. Probably put them with the voting blocks that matter most to them. So anyway, Alexander, the defund the police thing, we all know it's crazy. I think it's crazy on any level they look to justify it on. But what do you make of this? And then get into what was happening in London and
Australia. Of course. Well, let's first of all begin with the campaign to defund the police. I have to say, when I first heard about this, I mean, I just clutched my head in despair. I mean, as a slogan, this is complete lunacy. I mean, you know, there are people, you know, anarchists and people like that who've long argued about defunding the police or doing away with the police. They've always been a fringe. Now that fringe has, you know, sort of taken over. I mean, you know, the lunatics, it seems to me, are in charge if we are really talking in this way. I mean, that is so bizarre and so strange. And let's just be very clear. If you do away with the police, in a big city like Minneapolis. I mean, you know, small towns, maybe they can sort of regulate themselves up to a point, always only up to a point. But in a big city like Minneapolis, or, you know, God help us, New York, Los Angeles, London, you know, Berlin, wherever, if you do away with the police, who will suffer most? It's be the vulnerable people who will suffer most. The people who are poor, the people who try to run shops, who try to run small businesses, the hardworking, working people who are most exposed to the predatory activities of criminals, gangsters, drug dealers, you name it. They will love the, you know, the license that they will be given to engage in all the sorts of criminalities that, you know, you can imagine. Anyway, so it's now being rowed back, and partly I suspect it's because the Democrats have understood that if they persist with all of this, they have given the election to Donald Trump, because frankly, American people are not going to want to see their police disappear. So they row it back. What are they going to do? They're going to set up a slush fund, because that's what this is going to amount to. You take away some of the money from real policing, you give it to all kinds of people, you know, community support groups, all those sorts of people. And of course, we know exactly how that's going to work. It's going to create another layer of patronage systems controlled ultimately, because this is going to happen mainly in blue states, by the Democrat Party, which is going to entrench even further the political stranglehold that the Democrat Party has in these places. It is a recipe for corruption. I want to say this very
corruption that they control. Corruption that they control.
And corruption which will affect, let's be also very clear about this, the electoral process. And can I give an example of how that works? We have all of these people within the Democratic Party, so-called left-wing progressive people getting behind Bernie Sanders. And what we saw in the primaries was the way in which the black vote was hugely controlled and was swung behind Joe Biden. This will reinforce the oligarchical control within the Democratic Party in its client constituencies even further. So it's corrupt, it's electorally corrupt, it's a slush fund. Of course, some people are going to make a lot of money out of it, but it's going to take away money from police and transfer it to all the wrong sort of people. If you want to really deal with problems of policing in the United States, and I'm not the first person to admit there's lots of problems, no doubt there are problems with policing in the United States, you need to give the police more money, not less. That's my view.
Yeah. What about the UK and Australia, Alexander, shifting gears? And also how the world in general may be looking at this, because over here, we were looking at the protests. Okay, in the States, we were looking at it, and we were, okay, there was some understanding as to what was going on.
Yeah.
And, you know, people could say, okay, the U.S. is going through a difficult time. You know, the average Greek person, the average Cypriot say, okay, they have internal problems there. Fine.
Yeah.
But then, you know, we're looking at the news feeds from London and from Australia, and we're seeing, you know, protesters in the thousands on the streets. And the London ones the UK ones, actually, not even London, I believe Bristol as well, turned really violent. And I have to tell you, people here some people were scratching their heads going, what the F are people in London upset about? And another half of the people were laughing, going, this is ridiculous that people in the UK are protesting something that happened in Minneapolis. And actually, they were also protests in France, not to take away from Australia and the UK. Also, France went through protests. But if you ask me, you know, the protests in France, I think had a different dynamic to them, which I think was more focused on migrant issues more than anything. But get into
absolutely.
This.
But you know, you're quite right. I mean, London, Paris, Berlin, Australia, all of these places are now protesting about an incident that happened in Minneapolis. I mean, you know, a very contained incident involving two people. This has nothing to do with the life that we live here in Britain. I'm not saying that we don't have many problems in Britain and we don't have problems of relations between, racial issues, all sorts of things like this. But this is a problem in the United States. We are not protesting specifically anymore about those problems in the United States. This is, I think, a point that needs to be understood by our viewers. We are somehow assuming the problems that happen in the United States are our problems here. And I'm not convinced that's true at all. We are a radically different society. We have obviously our own problems, but they should not be framed in the way that they are being framed as part of that narrative. And I'm going to add something else. I mean, on top of everything, we are actually, in general, a law-abiding and orderly country. But as in the United States, what we're seeing is that these protests are being used increasingly here as a license for law breaking. Now, there was this statue in Bristol. I mean, the person whose statue was toppled has a terrible history. He was a slave dealer and all that. It is also against the law to topple statues. There is a legal way in which this sort of thing is done in Britain, and that is the way one should follow. I am never a person under any circumstances who will countenance law breaking. I don't countenance law breaking if it involves a police officer in Minneapolis, and I don't countenance law breaking if it involves a statue in Bristol. Law should always be observed, and it should be observed by protesters, and it should be observed by police, and it should be observed by everybody. And again, I repeat this, it's difficult to express or describe the extent to which the mood in Britain is almost boiling at the moment around this issue, even though, as I said, it's not an issue that arises from anything that has happened here. And that's exactly my feeling about what's happening in Australia and in Berlin and to some extent in France and in all sorts of other places. What is it about the United States that means that whatever happens in the United States, we feel we have to copy it?
All right. I mean, I don't want to harp on the statue issue, but I have to. And I think this is a tricky issue to tackle. You had ISIS, and they were destroying the statues in Palmyra, I believe.
Absolutely.
Historical artifacts, like priceless historical artifacts. And they were tearing them down in order to deface them, to change the ideological landscape of the territory, right? I mean, when you're at war, one of the first things that you do is you want to tear down the churches, tear down the statues, try to, change the face of the land, so to speak, as you're taking it over. You had it in Ukraine as well. During the Maidan and afterwards, during the Civil War, you saw, a lot of the people in the West and a lot of these forces in the West, the right sector, the Azov battalions, and all of these forces and their thugs, going through many of the large cities and the small towns, tearing down statues, which they thought, glorified Russia or glorified the Soviet past. And they were, just knocking them all down.
Absolutely.
Wiping away the history that they thought, doesn't express their history.
Yes.
In their opinion. So you had this in Ukraine.
Yes.
And it moved over to the US, and you had it, say, a couple of years ago where they started, with this whole tearing down of statues.
Yes.
And now it's been ramped up in the US, and now it's made its way to London as well, where people were, vandalizing the statue of Churchill. They tore down the statue in Bristol. And you said this guy may have, men of their time, whether it's Lenin, whether it's Stalin, whether it's Churchill, whether it's Robert E. Lee in the US. The statues are made of men who lived during their time and, made history.
Yes. Yes.
So,
well, it is. This is
the
it.
Tearing down of these things, to me, symbolizes an effort to wipe away that history, but also an effort to wipe away that culture that has been built on these men. It's a form of propaganda, isn't it?
Of course it is. I mean,
brainwash.
it's not just that. It's an attempt to replace one history with another history. In other words, to substitute, the historical passage that has built up the countries and which people have observed and which is built on, with a completely different historical narrative, a narrative that regards the past as something in a radically different way, as something that is somehow shameful, by the way. So that everything that has happened before is somehow understood through the political needs of the present. It reverses the flow of history. So,
And can I say before I forget, you also had the Iraq War. Well, I want to also mention this, where you had the U.S. military
absolutely
tearing down the statue of Saddam. So before I forget, there's also another instance of a famous statue tearing down.
And what is happening is, of course, as we see with so many other things, is that what was exported by the West outside, it was the Western governments which supported people in Maidan, toppling down statues of Lenin, even though in many places, by the way, in Ukraine, people were not happy about having the statues of Lenin or whatever it is toppled, because whatever they felt about Lenin, it was part of their history and part of their identity and an expression of who they were, and they felt that people coming from outside and toppling those statues was an attack on all of that, and it led to a terrible civil war. But the West supported that, and surprise, surprise, that kind of attitude is now being imported back, as it was bound to be. You can't create a border and say that you can do something in another country and that it won't come back and happen to you as well. Now, as I said, there are statues and there are statues. There's been some controversy about the statue in Bristol for a very long time, which I can understand, and there are legal ways to do this. I think that it's now expanding, and the talk about toppling Churchill because he had views which were of his time but not of our time, but which disregard everything else about him. That is extremely disturbing to me indeed. More to the point, it's very disturbing to a lot of British people also.
Where does it end, though? I mean, you said it just now. You start with the one statue, but it doesn't end, because you're going to be able to find a fault and a flaw in every statue that has been made of everybody that's all over the world. So where do you put it in? Do you have to sanitize everything? Does everything have to get sanitized at this point?
In the minds of some people, it does. But what it will actually do is provoke a reaction. I mean, that sooner or later, there is going to be a very, very powerful reaction to all of this. Just as we see this in many places, and just as there was there already is the signs of a reaction against defunding the police in the United States. So there will be to this. What it will do is it will create divisions within society which had never existed before.
I can't think, I went to university in Virginia. I can't think of Virginia and the history of Virginia without a figure like Robert E. Lee. No. I can't think of London. I can't think of the UK without a figure like Churchill. I can't think of the Soviet Union and Russia and Ukraine and that period in history without thinking about Lenin and Stalin and these figures. I'm trying to understand. Yeah, you try to understand the logic behind it, and there is no logic. There's a lot of emotion and misplaced emotion.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of stupidity, because it really is stupid to tear these things down. But there's no logic there. There's no thinking about, this is where we were, and this is how we got to where we are.
Correct. This is my own view. I mean, I trained as my very first degree was in history, and I always think of myself more than anything else as somebody whose first home was as a historian. And I completely agree with this. I think that, as I said, an attempt to completely recreate a country's historical landscape in this radical way, in this very artificial way, is completely and profoundly wrong. I mean, it's very dangerous. And I cannot imagine a British history of the 20th century which does not include Winston Churchill, who was its towering personality. I mean, not just during the war, by the way, both before and after the war. I mean, he was the single most important political leader in Britain throughout his lifetime. And if you take him out of the picture, then what you have left is a completely distorted view of British history during the 20th century. I mean, it no longer makes any kind of sense in terms of its history and in terms of understanding the kind of society that Britain has become, partly as a result of his own contribution to it. And the same is true, of course, I'm sure, in other places. Certainly it's true in Russia, as you said, and I've no doubt it's true in Virginia also. But that is the agenda some people clearly have.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you go to the Moscow metro, and you know, some of the stations have the statue or the head statue of Lenin, and it makes you think, it makes you reflect.
Absolutely, and it's important to say, it is very important to say, because there's been lots of opinion polls about this. Many people in Russia, in fact, the vast majority of people in Russia, including many who are strong anti-communists, value the presence of those things because they are their history, and they feel a certain sense that this is our past, and we want it there. Just as many people in France, you go to France today, you will find in many places statues of French kings, and France today is a republic. But you know, if you go to France, you will find Louis XIV in many places, Louis XV in many places also. You will find places named after the French monarchy, and then you'll find places named after Napoleon also. It's part of their history. It is part of their sense of continuity in who they are. It helps them to build their present and gives them choices about their future. If you remember what George Orwell said, what he said was, he who controls the present controls the past, he who controls the past controls the future. This attempt to control the past is very Orwellian.
Yeah, you know, it starts with a statue of Churchill, and then you move on to a statue of Mozart or Pushkin.
Well, whatever.
And then you move towards tearing down the Parliament building because that's the house where these laws were made. It just doesn't stop.
No, it doesn't.
And then you
stop.
actually target the real human beings because, you know, they're also at fault.
Yes,
it doesn't end.
Well, it is in the end profoundly totalitarian. I mean, can I just say, even the Soviets didn't go that far. If you go to Russia, you will find lots of statues of tsars. I mean, especially if you go to St. Petersburg, you will find Catherine the Great there, and Peter the Great there, and Nicholas I there, and Alexander III there. All those Soviets had, that was a totalitarian society, but they did understand that to a certain extent they had to preserve these things as part of the continuity of the country. But if you can remove all of these things, then, as I said, you are completely changing your past, your own history, and in a way that will circumscribe your ability to move into a future. So it has a totalitarian quality. Of that, I have no question.
All right, Alex, there's a long video, but just I want to wrap it up with your thoughts. How do you think China, Russia, Iran, I don't know, I'm trying to think other countries. How do you think Germany, how do you think they're all looking at this? Merkel's, the Xi Jinping's, the Merkels, the Putins, all these people, all these world leaders. Maybe I missed a couple as well, but how do you think they're up from the outside looking in? How do you think they're looking at what's going on in the U.S.?
Well, I think in a lot of places, I think they're looking at all of this and they're saying the U.S. has taken leave of its senses. That's what I think they think in Moscow and they think in Beijing. Of course, if you're talking about Beijing, they're quietly cheering it on because from their point of view, it's a nice opportunity to score a few points off the US. By the way, the Russians are not doing that. It's interesting that there is a contrast between China and Russia. The Chinese have been playing all of this because they're involved in a propaganda war with the US at this time. The Russians are staying away. Germany's different because, of course, some of these agendas that we see in the United States play out in Germany also. One shouldn't, and of course the Germans have a very particular and very complicated relationship with their past, to put it mildly. And Merkel is a strong enemy of Trump's, and is to some extent, to a great extent, the embodiment within Germany of many of the policies of the Democratic Party, which are leading to these events. So, there is a difference between Germany, but quite apart from that, around the rest of the world, people are looking at all of this with astonishment. And I'm going to say something else. A lot of people are saying, these same people who are protesting in this way, in Britain, in America, in wherever, Black Lives Matter, they don't actually care about Black lives in our countries. They are the people who advocate regime change wars, which kill people in their hundreds of thousands and even millions. So some lives matter, but not ours. And there is a great deal of cynicism about this, and a great deal of cynicism about the kind of people who are behind these protests in the United States and Britain and in all those other places.
Yeah. Case in point, Libya. All right.
Libya is a prime example. And let's not forget, Libya is an African country, and the people who were suffered most in Libya as a result of the war of aggression that was waged on that country were the Black African population of Libya, which was severely brutalized as a result of that war.
Yeah, a war waged by African-American U.S. president and Joe Biden,
Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, exactly, and of course by supported by all the same elements, that in Britain that are supporting these protests now.
All right, Alexander Mercouris, thank you very much. We'll leave it there.